Hi, everyone. We are fortunate enough to have our ex-CBCSer Nur, who did his PhD here at the University of Queensland, presenting on life after CBCS, what he's been up to. So he's going to be talking about his work in remote sensing and kelp forests. And he's currently doing his work through a postdoc at Stanford University and UCLA. So take it away, Nur.
Hey everyone, thanks Brock for the presentation. Yes, I'm doing now my postdoc with Fioresa Micheli at Stanford and Kyle Cabano at UCLA, and I'm very happy to be here. I left Australia now around a year and a little bit, and it's been very nice. There's a lot of things I miss, so I'm really happy to at least be able to show my work and see you for a little bit. So I'm gonna go straight to it. This is where I work. It's a giant kelp forest, and it's one of the most iconic and productive and biodiverse ecosystem in the world. You know, imagine an underwater rainforest. That's pretty much what it is. It can grow up to 20, 30 meters. And if you haven't been there, I really suggest you that you give it a go. But one of the issues that we have is that these forests are being lost or disappearing in many places. And that includes places like Tasmania, that has lost 95% of its giant kelp forest here in Australia. But also Northern California has lost around 90% of bull kelp forest. And in Mexico, also, we're losing around 50% of this forest. And that's happening in other parts of the world, like Western Australia and so on. But this is one of the iconic places that are being lost. And one of the reasons why, here we go. One of the reasons why this is moving is, are being lost are due to multiple human stressors, including climate change. And many of these kelp forests today are dominated by these sea urchin barrens that pretty much overgraze and eat the kelp and other species that want to settle in the substrate. And they create these barren rocks with not much life. And this is a bit basic trophic ecology, but it has to do with overfishing and human impacts due to the taking of those predators that can control the sea urchins. So there's a lot of space for management in these systems. Anyway, this was just kind of the introduction. Today, I'm gonna be talking about how I'm using remote sensing since my PhD and now in my postdoc to inform conservation for kelp forests and also to fill some of the gaps that we have in this community of research. And as I said, I'm a postdoc at Stanford. I still remain an honorary fellow at the University of Queensland. So very quickly, I'm gonna give an outline of the talk, of today's talk, just because I'm gonna be touching on a lot of different things and I don't want you to get lost. But first of all, I'm gonna briefly talk about my background, why I'm doing what I'm doing, and what are the gaps in kelp conservation overall. Then I'm gonna kind of talk a little bit about some of my PhD and postdoc work on climate adaptation for kelp forests. That's kind of a regional analysis and work. Then I'm gonna go a bit more global and show you, present you the results of this new analysis on how well kelp forests are protected and the threats that they face to marine heat waves. And then I'm gonna go more local to a case study in Mexico and show you how there's a range contraction of some of these important species in Mexico. And finally, just discuss a bit of the next steps and the conclusion of the work that I'm doing. So my background, I grew up in the Mediterranean Sea in this beautiful coastline in Spain, Catalonia, where it was very easy for me to snorkel and get in the water. And I kind of like to say that I come from the future because I spend my days seeing this beautiful place and hearing the stories of a great ocean that wasn't there anymore. But then I was lucky enough that there was a marine reserve established when I was around 10 years old. And in that place, life was coming back. So I really hear these amazing stories of this life coming back, and that kind of gave me hope. Then in my undergrad, while I was in Spain, I moved to Mexico for an exchange year. And there I discovered this amazing kelp forest, booming with life and full of big creatures and things that I wouldn't see in the Mediterranean Sea. So I really fell in love, did my exchange year, stayed for my master's, and it was really nice. But then there was this very strong marine heat wave, the strongest and longest that was registered in the North Pacific Ocean, that lasted from 2014 and 16, and I witnessed the loss of these ecosystems. So this kind of two events in my life has been shaping what I did in my PhD and what I'm doing now, which is all related to marine protected areas, kelp forests, and climate adaptation. I kind of mix all of these things in different ways. Basically, this is just a general snapshot of kelp forests. There's around 112 kelp forest species, laminaria kelp species. They cover 30%, or they're the dominant habitat, marine habitat in 30% of the coastlines. That's twice as much as coral reefs. So these ecosystems are very important, abundant, productive, and they're everywhere. But from this 112 species, there's just a few, 3 species, Macrocystis or giant kelp, bull kelp, and bamboo kelp, I think it's called in South Africa, that form this massive kelp forest that can actually grow to the surface, float, and create a canopy that then we can detect with remote sensing and other methods. And some of the gaps in kelp forest conservation, for example, are the IUCN Red List assessment. So for example, corals have been assessed since 2008 or published the Red List assessment for coral reef, for coral species since 2008, mangroves 2010, and seagrass 2011. We're still waiting for the kelp forest assessments, and there's only one species that has been assessed based on its level of threat. Not only that, but this was a recent paper that came out from Sean from the center from CBCS. This amazing work that assessed how well marine and terrestrial habitats were represented inside protected areas, and I was really excited to see it, but then at the same time angry. I'm not angry at them, but just at the realization that kelp forests were neglected. So kelp forests were not in this analysis, and this was really concerning for me, and it has been kind of one of the drivers of a lot of the work that I've been doing in the past couple of years. And this is really important because marine heat waves are impacting kelp forests all around the world. So marine heat waves are these anomalous warm temperature times that really push this, that can really push these ecosystems to new states, range contractions, changes of the community, changes, as we were saying, to sea urchin barrens, and it's impacting this kelp forest in Western Australia, in New Zealand, in Tasmania, Mexico, California, Japan, all around the world. So it's really important that we start to think about climate adaptation strategies to manage these kelp forests under all of these changes. And that's part of what I've been doing in my PhD and postdoc. And it's backed up by a recent report from the IPCC that identified kelp forests as the second most at-risk marine ecosystem from climate change. So it's really a priority that we start to find approaches to do that. And one way that we can do that is to fill the basic gap of where are these forests and what's their dynamics. And we can use remote sensing for that. So there's this amazing data set that collaborators from UCLA, Kyle Cavanaugh, who's someone that I work with, was my postdoc advisor and is still, they've developed this amazing data set that goes for most of North America, that gives us 40 years of these satellite images at a 30 by 30 resolution and at a seasonal timescale. So we can really see the dynamics of this ecosystem. And I've been using this data set for different ways. One of it is for mapping potential climate refugia. So as you can imagine, it's very difficult on large spatial scales to identify areas that are acting as climate refugia, especially for the ocean. One thing that we can use is this type of cost-effective measures, such as ecosystem attributes, that gives us information of what's going on in the system. And we've done that by, for example, mapping kelp forest persistence. So how often does a satellite detect kelp forest in that pixel? And that's important because those places that have been persisting, despite of all of these changes, heat waves, human impacts, and so on, are potentially indicating areas acting as climate refugia. And we've been using this type of data set for other parts, for other work. And this is my last PhD chapter that I'm hoping to finally get out, hopefully soon. But in this work, we use this data set to inform the design of climate smart and transboundary networks of marine protected areas between Southern California and the north of Baja California. And I'm not going to get into the details of this, and I will just quickly show you one of the analyses so you have a sense of how we've been using this data set. For example, one of the climate adaptation strategies is to maintain ecological connectivity into the future. And what we did is develop this connectivity model based on the dispersal of larvae and oceanographic models of this kelp species in this region. And we did two contrasting scenarios. One, which is the present scenario that is tailored to the amount of kelp that is available in any given moment. And then the other scenario is a future scenario where we shorten the dispersal duration of larvae, which is one of the expectations of increased temperature, but also tailored analysis to only the availability of this potential climate refugia. So only this highly persistent kelp. And what we find is that it is likely that by the end of the century, 50% of these connections in the network could be lost and many places could become isolated. So that has important implications for designing networks of climate-smart marine protected areas. That's on the transboundary and climate-smart marine protected area planning. But as a result also of these maps, we thought, well, let's assess how well are these potential climate refugia or persistent kelp, how well are they protected in this area? So we did that for Central California, Southern California, and two regions in Baja California, which is kind of the region where giant kelp is the dominant canopy forming species. And we classified MPAs based in different types of fishing restriction. We classified kelp persistence based on different categories, high, medium, and low persistence. And we did this basic spatial overlay. And we found that Baja California has less than 1% of this highly persistent kelp forest protected. And that is really important because this region is located near the southern distribution limit. So these kelp forests are already in warmer temperatures, and it's likely they're going to be more threatened by this increased intensity in heat waves. So it is a priority to protect these areas. And in this work that is published, if you want to check it, we did a bit more stuff, adjusted representation targets to actually account for the dynamics of kelp, to ensure that we're actually protecting kelp forests that will likely be there and not just the distribution of kelp. So there's a bit more into it, and this is one of the general findings. We kind of replicated this effort and added a bit more to it, but for bull kelp. So bull kelp forests become the dominant species north of Central California, all the way to Alaska. And we did this analysis for California, Oregon, and Washington, and we find that only 3% of these kelp forests are protected inside no-take marine reserves, which are kind of the most important at recovering biodiversity, recovering those top predators that can control things like sea urchins. So they're the places that we know that work the best. But importantly, less than 1% of the highly persistent kelp in the entire region is protected. And this is very important because, for example, Northern California, so in California, there was a network of MPAs established. And Northern California has less than 1% or around 1% of this kelp protected. And when we look at the highly persistent kelp, only one little pixel was protected. So 0.001, super small value. And this is really concerning because there was a network designed based on the scientific guidelines in this region. And it seemed that kelp forests were neglected from that network. And not only that, but it's important because these ecosystems, as I mentioned before, collapsed. So this area has lost 90 to 95% of its kelp forests. They're now dominated by sea urchin barrens, and it's an economic catastrophe in the region. And it's a question worth to ask, what would have happened if this region, after the heat waves, if this place was better, if these places were better protected? There's many complexities there, which I'm not gonna get into, but this work is also published this year, so you can check those details if you're interested. Okay, so in a way, I kind of got that anger or that need and concern to understand what's going on with kelp forest protection in these regions, right? So I should be in peace, but no, I'm not. I am peaceful, but not for these things. Anyway, I'm going off the way here. Anyway, so what I did is, let's look at what's going on globally. Let's fill that gap. And what I did is grab all existing maps of remote sensing for these floating species, right? Those ones that we can identify with remote sensing. There were maps for America, North America, new maps that came from the team that I'm working from Peru, Tierra del Fuego in Argentina, the Falkland, Malvines Islands, South Africa, and Tasmania. So I put all of that together, and when I didn't have, or when it wasn't available, a local map, we used a global map from a collaborator of mine that is part of this paper, that she did a global analysis that has some, it's not as precise as the local ones, but it was good to kind of fill those gaps and get that first estimate. So we did that. We looked at the protection based on how well is restricted, how restrictive to fishing these areas are. And what we find, I'm gonna take a break here because there's a lot of things going on, but what we find is that it's actually not doing that bad. It's around over 10% of kelp forests are fully protected inside no-take marine reserves. And when we look at the combination of less restrictive, partially and fully protected, it's actually over 30%. So we would think that no worries, it's doing great. But when we look a little bit more carefully, most of these fully protected areas are in France. So these are Southern Ocean islands like Kerguelen Island that are fully protected as a large marine reserve in an isolated area.
Gross.
Sorry, and the coverage of kelp is gigantic. There's a lot of kelp in this region. So when we look at we exclude the Southern Ocean islands and we look at the rest of the world, the percentage is actually around 2.5%. The other thing that we did is, okay, now that we have these maps, we can assess what are the threats that these kelp forests have faced from heat waves and will face into the future based on different projections and different circulation scenarios. So we did that, and what we find is really interesting because not all places, not all ecoregions will be impacted into the future in the same way by heat waves. There are some really big differences, and I don't want to overload you with information, but this is a simple figure that has the latitude. So this is the aggregated pixel per latitude value of cumulative intensities, which is a metric of marine heat waves per year. So the higher, the warmer it will be and the more threatened. And we looked at the observed, so that's since 1980 to today. And then we did these projections to 2100 based on different scenarios. And what we find is that the Northern Hemisphere, kelp forests in the Northern Hemisphere will be more threatened by heat waves than the Southern Hemisphere. And also in the Northern Hemisphere, there is a gradient of warming from Alaska to Baja California. And then in the Southern Hemisphere, the relationship is the opposite. So the places that are warmer, which are Peru, will be more threatened by heat waves than the places that are colder, which is Chile. And in the Northern Hemisphere is the opposite. Alaska, which is the coldest place, will warm more. That's an interesting relationship that I'm not going to discuss, and I have to do much reading to understand. But this is just to show you how different and variable all of this is looking for, and the implications for adapting and managing these kelp forests under this heat wave impacts or threats. Okay, so we can finally mix all of this data, the protection, the heat waves, and have a better picture of how things are looking. We have, again, the cumulative heat wave intensity in the y-axis, and then the top figure is no-take marine protected areas, so fully protected, percentage of protected of each ecoregion. Each ecoregion is a circle. The size of that circle is the amount of area, of kelp area that ecoregion has. And then below we have the same, but for all the MPAs. And what really is interesting is what I was mentioning before. Most of these remote islands have 100% protection, and we know that there's a lot of papers that have assessed this type of analysis and find that these isolated places are more protected. And some of the more threatened places like the Bering Sea, the Gulf of Alaska, Peru, that will be more threatened by heat waves are really not protected and not much protected. And as you can see, much of the ecoregions are not reaching that 10% target. So there's a lot to do here and a lot to explore. Anyway, that was kind of, I think now my anger is a bit more at peace. So we got this analysis done, and hopefully we'll have that paper submitted soon. We're working on that. Now I'm gonna go and kind of finish the talk with a more regional analysis. So we went to local scale, kind of North America, then we went to the global, and now I'm gonna go a bit more local to Baja California, Mexico, which is where giant kelp founds, as I was mentioning, its warm distribution limit. where it's probably going to be more threatened by these heat waves. And it's a great place to study, to understand how we can move forward for climate adaptation of this kelp forest. The background here is, this is my first PhD chapter that was published, where we used this underwater data set that we had of the fish, invertebrate, and algae community. And also we used remote sensing to understand how these kelp forests were impacted by that 2014-16 strong marine heat wave. And we found that, yes, kelp forests were impacted, they were beyond the natural variability. We lost half of the species in that analysis. Community structure was different. We have invasive species that appeared, warm water species became more abundant, and so on. So we really identified these community-wide impacts. Now the question is, what's going on today, 7 years after this event? And I've been monitoring this kelp forest for a while now, but since last year, we did this bigger effort where we combined many resources and efforts and institutions, including Stanford, including funding from UQ, including funding from Nat Geo, and from University of San Diego at Scripps. And we put this expedition together. We did a bunch of things, but what's really relevant for this is we surveyed as many kelp forests as we could, and taking most of, well, actually all of the distribution of giant kelp forest in Mexico. So that's around 800 kilometers of latitude, thousands of kilometers of coastline. So we went in this amazing expedition for a couple of weeks. This is some of us diving from the little boat once we go to the place. We saw some fun friends that were following us, sometimes biting us. And these are some of the kelp forests that we saw, this massive, very healthy kelp forest extending for 7-8 kilometers along the coastline. And just want to acknowledge the amazing support that we received from the local communities. So we worked very close with the fishing communities in Baja California. They gave us logistic support, and also 2 community divers that are trained for the underwater surveys. They came with us, they were part of the crew, and they did an amazing job. Some of them even leading some of these surveys. And I'm now going to present a bit of the data. It's a combination of remote sensing and underwater data set. The first one is a general analysis of what's going on today. So we compare the average area before and after the heat wave. So the before represents 30 years, kind of a baseline period, and after is the 7 years or 6 years after the heat waves. And what we find is that 50% of the kelp has been lost compared to that baseline. And that baseline includes previous heat waves, previous moments of low coverage. Since 2021, we have a complete loss in the north of 100 kilometers. So that's the region close to the border with the US, where most of the human population is located. So it's kind of the more impacted area. Then we found an increase in kelp coverage very close to the southern distribution limit, just a bit over it. This amazing kelp forest extending for many kilometers. And then we found a range contraction of 100 kilometers in the south. And I'll kind of walk you through a little bit now, focusing a bit more into these 3 kind of unique states or scenarios. The first one in the north, as I was saying, we lost this kelp. This is analysis comparing how much the kelp changed or recovered compared to the baseline. So it's the percentage change of area compared to those 30 years baseline. So blue means it's below average, red, blue is above average, red is below average. And you can clearly see how in the north, this area that most humans live, big cities like Tijuana and Ensenada, close to San Diego, it kind of was impacted by the heat wave 2016, wanted to recover, and then collapsed. Now, when we go to the south, we can see this, the place that was just over the southern limit, it really was impacted, almost went to 100% loss, and then it quickly bounced back, and now it's actually thriving and the coverage is actually much higher than the baseline. And finally, in the south, we can see how this ecosystem completely collapsed for this kelp forest, and now it's 100% loss every year since 2015. Now, the cool thing is that we can combine this with the underwater data set, and that's what we find in the north. So we have this bare rocks dominated by sea urchins and no kelp.
Thanks, Fred.
When we go farther south, we have this amazing forest, thriving, full of life. There's no fish that came in this footage, but trust me, it's pretty full of life, lobsters, invertebrates, everything, and it's really doing well. And then finally, hope you're seeing the videos good. But finally, we have in the southern limit, sorry for that, let me see if I can find it. We have this other kelp forest, not giant kelp. We call them Eclonia arborea, which is similar to a species in Australia. It's doing very well. It's this healthy ecosystem, but it's not dominated by giant kelp. So that's kind of the three scenarios today of this kelp forest, that before they were all dominated by giant kelp. Now, what we can do is look at the species from the underwater surveys and try to understand if we can see what's going on with those species. Are they explaining something? First of all, we have this, we plotted here the abundance per site of the species that we saw in the transects in the survey, going from the south to the north. 27 is the distribution limit, 27 degrees. Over 32 is getting close to the border with US. And the first figure is for giant kelp, and you can see that it matches very well with the satellite. So the satellite doesn't lie. Where there's no kelp detected by the satellite, we didn't see kelp underwater. And you can see that range contraction. You can see that that absence in the north, and you can see that where it's most abundant is just around that 28-degree latitude. When we look at the next, which is that warmer, I didn't say this, but this is the warmer kelp species, more tolerant, Eclonia arborea, that palm kelp. We can see that it's relatively abundant in the south, and then it decreases in the north, and we didn't really see it. Then when we go at the lobster and sheephead, which is a fish, both of these species are sea urchin predators, very important sea urchin predators. And we can see how in the south, these species are abundant. Sheephead is in biomass of large animals, but let's just say it's abundance. And you can see how in the south, in the north, they pretty much become, we don't see them. There's very few, and in some places we didn't see. I think we only saw a few, 2 lobsters in one site in the entire week that we were in the north. And finally, the sea urchins, you can see the opposite relation, very low values in the south, and it increases in the north. We can plot these species, these relationships, and it's very clear that we have this trophic cascade, this control of these predators of the sea urchins, lobster and sheephead. So where we have high abundances of this, we don't have sea urchins. Same thing with the competition of the 2 algae or 2 kelp, where we have giant kelp, where we have high abundances of the palm kelp, we don't have giant kelp, and vice versa. And finally, as expected, high abundances of sea urchins, there's no giant kelp. So that's kind of the scenario. And we could just, you could ask me, that's great, but you've only used 1 year. Well, we've tried to address that and ask the question, were all of these preconditions already there before the heat wave? And that's how these 3 places took kind of 3 different alternative states. And the answer is yes. So we used these different data sets that were available, and we found that in the north, sea urchins were already abundant before the heat wave, and we had low values of the other kelp species. The green represents an ARIMA model of the Landsat kelp data. So pretty much it means high peaks or low peaks, they're outliers. So we can see that this area was not stable through time with a lot of peaks, and you can see how after the heat wave, sea urchins skyrocketed. When we go to the south, and just to mention, as I already mentioned, this area is highly populated. There's a lot of fishing pressure. There's a lot of things happening. As we go in the south, this place is very well managed by these fishing cooperatives that they have community marine reserves. They take fishing quotas. They work closely with the scientists, with the NGOs, and they're doing a great job at managing these resources. And also, they're very isolated, and there's very low human impacts. And you can see how this kelp has been very stable through time, very low abundances of sea urchins, and the golden green color represents the palm kelp, also relatively low values. And finally, in the south, you can see how this palm kelp was already there before the heat wave, waiting for the moment to outcompete giant kelp, and how this ecosystem, the giant kelp, collapsed. So this is really important because it has implications for management, and the management is different across the region. In the north, we need to really start establishing marine reserves. There's no marine reserves. There are a few marine protected areas, but they're not they're not well managed, there's no restrictions, they're not working. And likely just by taking into account, probably these marine reserves plus restrictions on the fishing of some of these species that are important for controlling sea urchins could help build the resilience to this ecosystem for future heat waves. The southern part is doing great, and we have a lot to learn from it. And it's amazing to see how this ecosystem is thriving. This place is actually the most resilient, or one of the most resilient places of all of California and Baja California. It's the one that recovered faster. So there's many things happening, but also good management is really making a difference. And finally, in the south, there's probably opportunities for restoration. There's been experiments before removing this palm kelp species, and giant kelp can recover. So there's a lot of opportunity there. But also it might not be necessary, and maybe this kelp forest ecosystems are also productive enough to sustain the fisheries that depend on them, but also the biodiversity in it. So that's kind of the talk that I have planned. Just to wrap it up, there are gaps in kelp conservation. In many ways, we're behind 15, 20 years compared to corals, seagrass, and mangroves. We're trying to fill those gaps. Kelp forests are the second most threatened marine ecosystem in the world by climate change. So we really need to wrap up and find climate adaptation strategies and develop methods and metrics that can help us do that. And we're trying to do that. And finally, there are these management strategies that we can really learn from that work and can support the recovery of this kelp species forest, as we've seen in Mexico. And the next steps that we're doing, as of today, I started my new postdoc from this funding that we got with Theo, who's in the chat at Stanford, and also Kyle Cabano, who's another person that was my postdoc advisor at UCLA, and other collaborators, and the fishing community in Mexico, and local NGOs, to actually apply all of this knowledge that we have now and understand, are these places really refuges for climate change? What can we learn from them? Are MPAs or community reserves in these places working? And what climate adaptation strategies we can co-develop with the communities for Mexico and to inform other parts of the world. And that's what we're going to be doing in the next couple of years. Finally, also filling those gaps, we just put together this new IUCN Seaweed Specialist Group that I happen to be co-chair with Jackie from Deakin University in Melbourne. And hopefully very soon we'll start working in the assessment of the kelp species to see what's their level of threat for those 112 species. So hopefully we'll be filling that gap very soon. And this is something that I'm not leading, but it's worth mentioning. There's the Kelp Forest Alliance that was established last year by Aaron, who was a PhD student at the University of Sydney, and I think he's worked with some of the CBCS people. So they put this Kelp Forest Alliance, which is also something that was needed, and it's very focused on restoration, but it's a very beautiful way of bringing the entire community together. And I hopefully will try to help Aaron build a little bit on the protection side of that. So a lot of more work will be happening there. So with this, I'm just trying to say that we're really ramping up efforts for kelp forest restoration, protection, and conservation in this past couple of years. And finally, and this is probably the part that is most exciting for me, I'm trying to build this NGO to bring together different people working with kelp forests, especially in Latin America, through using this underwater expeditions, remote sensing data sets, and the experience that we have to really help protect and manage kelp forests around the world, specifically for now in Latin America. So the first thing that we're going to do in a month, we're going to be in this expedition in that boat in August of this year, doing similar surveys to what we did last year for the Lemfast Ocean Program. Then hopefully in November, I'm going to visit Tierra del Fuego for an expedition with them to see if we can actually use and kind of use the same methods for monitoring this kelp forest and also teach them how to use the remote sensing data set. Then I'm trying to put together this expedition in Peru in February 2024 to assess how these kelp forests are doing today. El Nino is really hitting them, so we were likely going to see a lot of impacts. And it happens that we just mapped Peru using remote sensing. So now we can do similar work than what we're doing in Mexico. And finally, we'll be doing training in Chile with Alejandra Mora and other colleagues from there for Latin America in Spanish on how to use remote sensing and other tools for kelp conservation and ecology. And that will be in February, hopefully 2024 in Chile. We'll send an advertise. So if anyone from that part of the world wants to learn this, you're welcome to join. And that's kind of everything that I had for today. Just a thank to everyone, past and present, including Hugh, who was my advisor at University of Queensland, and he really allowed me and gave me the opportunity to explore all of these things. That's a lot of the work that I'm doing, so I'm really thankful for that. To Fio and Kyle that have really been supportive in these past years. Fio has been supporting me for 7-8 years now, so thanks everyone. Gabby from Mexico and UABC that has also been very supportive, and everyone else, including Dave from the sunny coast that has also been very supportive. And that's kind of it from my side. Hopefully I didn't go too long. So thanks everyone, and I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Nur. We might start with, are there any questions in the chat since there's quite a lot of people online?
No, not so far.
No questions in the chat yet. If there's any questions from people online, feel free to type them into the chat. Is there any questions from people in the room? And I might kick things off to give people a little bit of time to think. I think that's a clap. It's a clap, not a raised hand. Right, so Nur, I wanted to ask you, super amazing work that you're doing. First of all, I was wondering, so how much of an impact, you were talking a lot about expanding the protected area network around kelp forests. How much of an impact does their protection actually have for mitigating the threat of climate change to them? How does that safeguard them, or are they still highly at risk even if they're protected?
Yeah, thanks for the question, bro. That's a great question. And a PhD student called Joy here at Stanford is looking at that. And so there's mainly one thing that marine protected areas can do, especially restrictive ones, which is protecting those top predators, recovering them. They can't really do that much when the heat wave is happening. And when the heat wave comes, kelp is just lost. But it's more about the recovery and the control of those sea urchin predators. So sea urchins, when heat wave comes and kelp disappears, they become hungry, they go out and they overgraze everything. When that doesn't happen and there's healthy kelp, sea urchins are just comfortable eating drift kelp. So one thing that marine reserves can do is control those sea urchins by having those predators. So it's more about the recovery and the resilience of the system. And Joy is working on that, and she is finding some initial evidence that marine protected areas recovered better after the heat waves than non-protected kelp forest.
Excellent, very, very interesting. We've got Carissa with her hand up. Go for it, Carissa.
Hey, Nur, how are you?
Hey.
Sorry about
Good,
that. I
Carissa,
wasn't on mute earlier and I interrupted your thing. I do have a question, and I'm so glad you're still working on kelp forests. I love kelp forests. I guess my question is, what would your advice be to say marine planners that don't have their persistent kelp mapped and can't map their kelp using remote sensing, because not all kelp species are like giant kelp and are floating on the surface? So what would be
Lost
your
you for a second, Carissa.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just lost it. Just cut for a second when you were saying about my advice for those planners, then it cut.
Yeah, so what would your advice to planners embarking on, say, a protected area planning exercise be if they didn't have their persistent kelp mapped, and if they couldn't map their kelp using remote sensing because the species living in the area aren't like giant kelp floating on the surface? What would be your advice to them to help, I guess, improve their chances of capturing the kelp forests in the region without the time of monitoring and remote sensing their kelp species?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we can only map 3 of these species really, which of course they're one of the most productive and all of that, but there's thousands of coastline that we don't have this kelp forest. And it's a tough question that I really don't know how to answer. There are some models of species distribution models available of where we expect to find kelp. You could use that. But also, I guess, some citizen science, well, not citizen science, some knowledge from locals of where they think that kelp forests are or have been mostly. So it's a tough question, and I think that will require different data sets and different information. But just to add a positive note, these kelp forest maps will become available, at least for the places that there's canopy floating globally. And there's a TNC California with Kyle Cabanor leading that effort. So all of these countries will become available with those maps, at least for the canopy floating ones.
Cool, thanks. We have some amazing kelp forests here in Moreton Bay Marine Park that are not well mapped at all, but they're not floating species. So you'll have to come back and have a look. They're really cool.
Yeah, I'd love to. I hear they're deep.
They're very deep. Yeah, very deep.
Yeah.
Too deep for diving.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Some roughs.
I'll ask you, I have another question for you, Nur, unless I'm jumping in. Does anyone else have a question for Nur before I ask one? Any other questions from the people online? Okay, I will go ahead. I was wondering, Nur, how long does it take for a kelp forest to recover? So you were talking about the forest in southern Baja California. Did it take, like how long did it take to get back to its full state?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So kelp are super dynamic, and that's why it's so important to map things like their persistence, because they, one year they're there, the other year they're not there. So they're very dynamic. And the same way when they recover or when they impact it. So in those places in Southern California, some places recovered in the following year. So really in 1 year, if the conditions are good, if the water is colder, there's nutrients and the proper conditions, they just get back to the normal. And I didn't say this, but in the north of Baja California, this place that is now dominated by sea urchins, there's been La Nina, so the conditions have been very cold, very nutrient rich, and there should be thriving kelp forest. And they're not because of that. So if the conditions are good and there's no sea urchins and everything is healthy, they recover very quickly in less than 1 year.
Okay, and is there much management of the sea urchins that happens? Like collecting them and getting rid of them, or is it mainly about making sure that their predators are protected?
Yeah, so in California especially, there's a lot of efforts. Some are efforts like reef check, others are by scientists, others by communities that are taking sea urchins out. And some places it works, there are a bit of recovery, but the scale of it is just massive. And sea urchins are mobile, so you may clean one patch and a few days later, other sea urchins move on and just do their job. So the amount of sea urchins is so high and so spread that it's really difficult to manage them and restore them with removal. Of course, it works, and there are successful cases, but at a large scale, it's really difficult. And that's why you probably need a combination of healthy ecosystems, the predators, but also restoration, and any strategy that we can think of. And in Mexico, I'm not, or my team is not doing anything related to restoration for now, but there are some efforts to establish a national restoration program with my previous master advisor and other colleagues from there. They're trying to do that. I'm not sure how it's going, but there are efforts trying to do that.
Sorry, we've got a comment from the room. Yes.
Hi. I'm just curious, like they do with the crown of thorns starfish here, where they just inject them with vinegar, would that potentially be an option to inject the sea urchin with vinegar? At least you don't have to remove them, then they just I don't know. Would that be a potential?
Yeah,
solution?
so I'm not sure, honestly, about the vinegar. I know they do it in the corals, but what they do is kill them pretty much. So they go, because sea urchins, if you have something a bit pointy, you just go like that, a little bit hard, and you kill them. So there's a lot of that. There's a lot of removal. And I don't know if they've tried other ways like vinegar, honestly.
Yes.
And yeah, and just so you know, that's a problem everywhere there is a temperate system, not only for big kelp forest. In the Mediterranean Sea, we have this problem. You have this problem in New South Wales, where there's a lot of urchins. In Tasmania, in any temperate ecosystem can have this problem. So it's something that we know for decades now, and there's a lot of research on it.
We're really lucky in South Africa, we don't have that problem because our sea urchins can't eat the kelp hold fast, so they don't. It's just a.
Sorry, they have to speak up, come to the camera,
Oh.
to the, like.
In South Africa, we don't have the urchin barren problem because our little urchins actually can't eat the hold fast of the kelp.
Oh, cool.
So it's one of the places, it's just random facts today. A lot of people panic when they see a lot of sea urchins there, but actually it's not an issue.
But they're not an issue. That's good. Yeah, of course, every system is a bit different, and it has different species that act or have different behavior. So some places are more lucky.
I might ask you, if there's no other questions from anyone on Zoom or from the room, I might ask you one more question, or maybe two more questions. The first one is, do you think people are aware of the ecosystem services and how important kelp forests are? Do you think there's a wide enough appreciation for their importance, and do local communities appreciate how beneficial they are? Or do you think they're still very under-regarded?
Yeah, I think it's still work in progress, but I think it's much better than a few years ago. It's really going quickly now with the kelp. It's getting a lot of attention. And there was just a paper that came out about the ecosystem services and the value of kelp. A preliminary, a first effort to do that, but a great effort. So I think we're getting closer and closer to having more people understanding that. But for sure, we're still, as I was saying, back many decades in those terms compared to other marine ecosystems. And I'm not even going to compare it to terrestrial systems. So I would say that, yes, that's also a big part of the outreach that we need to do. And I'm trying to do that now in Mexico. We're going to have a few people coming and just doing a bit of photography and filming, just so we can also, just tell the people in the world that these ecosystems exist and that they're threatened. Because, for example, in Mexico, many Mexicans don't even know that they exist. And I'm sure that happens also in Australia, where many Australians don't know they have kelp forest or the threats that they face. So there's a lot of communication there as well.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they're very under the radar, but so important and beautiful. And the footage that you showed was amazing. We have a question from Joy. So she said, you described a series of trips to Peru and Chile. What are your primary long-term goals for the Latin American NGO coalition that you're forming?
That's a good question, Joy. So that it's all, beginning. So everything, like, I'm probably going to say something in a year it will be different because it's forming. But the idea is to build a network of people working with kelp forests in Latin America, where we have standardized protocols for the data collection, but also for the use of this remote sensing data set that will be available in all of these places. So we can provide all of that data set and do some training for other people to know how to use them, map this persistence, do some basic analysis, and also use this for planning. So that's one of the visions, to kind of have set protocols, build that network, and then help each other as we face similar or different threats and learn from each other. So It's still building, but hopefully we're going to build a network. And then from there, we'll see how to address the issues that every place has, or how to help address. It's not conservation, it's difficult.
Great. All right. If there's no final questions for Nur, I will ask you my final question, which is, when are you coming back to Britain? When are we gonna see you again?
I lost you for a second there.
When are you coming back? When are you gonna visit you?
Well, yeah, well, I'm also in contact with people from Tasmania and mainland Australia, like South Australia and Victoria, because it has giant kelp. So hopefully when I visit them for work related, or there's a conference or something, if I go to Australia, I'm gonna visit for sure, and hopefully in the next couple of years, but I have no idea. I have no idea when that will happen, but hopefully before 2025, and we can talk more about kelp.
Excellent, amazing.
If anyone wants to visit us, I'm gonna do a spoiler here. We work in Hopkins Marine Station, which is this beautiful research station in front of the ocean. We can see kelp from the office. There's sea otters. It's a marine reserve, 60, 70 years old marine reserve, Hopkins Marine Reserve. So if anyone wants to come, it's a beautiful place for Kelp Forest, and I'm happy to host any of you.
Amazing. Is Hopkins Marine Reserve, that's in Mexico?
No, that's in California, in Monterey, where I'm based now. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow,
it's where the
sorry, I think I just said I didn't know that there was sea otters there.
Yeah, there's sea otters and seals and sea lions and everything.
Wow, cool. All right, excellent. Thank you so much, Nur. That was such, a very inspiring and concerning presentation. So yeah, great work. Keep up the good work, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to be here. Thanks for hosting me, and hopefully we'll see you soon.